Mhm. Hello, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to Akin and Matthew Brown for getting this together, setting up the technology and so on. It's a great honor to address interested people all over the world on African literature, people who are interested in African literature. But before I begin, let me also uh, recall the memory of my dear, dear, dear friend, Tejumola Olaniyan, who departed suddenly from our midst in November of last year. Teju was like a brother to me. He was a great intellectual interlocutor, and he was the most generous human being I can imagine. Was a great, intellectual interlocutor. There are many, many ideas that I first tested by sending works in progress to him over at least 2 decades. And so his death is a loss not just to me, but to the African Literature, in fact, African Studies Association family in general. It's something that I think about often. And to commemorate his memory, I have lit a candle to show that he is with us. And I'm going to leave it lit until the end of this session as symbolic that Teju is with us. The ancient Egyptians had it that there are two kinds of death: the death of the body, and the second death is when your name is not mentioned by those who love you. And so we want to keep Teju away from that death of namelessness. And so if I mention his name today and I light the candle, is to show that for me and for many of us, he's still alive and with us. Now, what I want to do today, let me share my screen, is to talk about the question of tragedy, which, of course, we are going to. So I'm just going to follow a number of steps. First is that I'll lay out some tragic concepts and definitions, and then also attempt a critique. All these will be shortened, and then go to the meat of the talk itself, which will be taking us through a number of textual segments from different African writers. And then we'll unthread certain general principles about tragedy from these texts. I'm hoping to speak for roughly 35 minutes, and then the rest will be given up to discussion. Now, the first issue when thinking about tragedy is, of course, definitional. It is not unusual for discussions or usages of the word tragedy to be found in various media, in the newspapers, and so on. But it is normally used simply to denote sad things. So the earthquake was tragic, or the political cynicism of the current regime is tragic, and so on and so forth, which is normally used to denote merely sad things or bad things, versus the more technical and literary historical term tragedy, which pertains specifically to certain forms of representation and certain kinds of content. But it's not unusual for the popular usage of the word to coincide with the more technical usage. I'm going to be focusing predominantly on the more technical literary historical usage, because we need to get a sense of that term so that we can recognize a literary tragedy when we see it. Now, of course, tragedy, the history of tragedy is traced back to the ancient Greeks. And the theorist that has been most responsible for sharpening the terms by which we understand it is Aristotle. In his Poetics, he gives us a number of key words. He tells us that a plot is the soul of tragedy. Peripateia is important, which means reversal of fortunes. Hamartia, which is error of judgment, and some mistranslated, by the way, but I'm not going to go into that. Tragic flaw. So hamartia is mistranslated as tragic flaw. Anagnorisis is the knowledge that arrives at the precise moment of the reversal of fortunes. And then eudaimonia is the good life. Now, in reading, in my own practice, Akin has already mentioned that I am publishing. He said I'm writing, but it's written. It's shortly forthcoming from Cambridge University Press, a new book titled Tragedy and Postcolonial Literature. And in this book, I lay out what the stakes are from a postcolonial perspective to revisit Aristotle. Among other things, I note that there are two critiques to his key terms. Unfortunately, there's no enough time to go over it all. And one comes from the idea of anagnorisis, which is knowledge. Typically, anagnorisis is Oedipus has been predicted to kill his father and marry his mother. He has done so without finding out, without being conscious. Sophocles' play is devoted to the unpeeling of these transgressions. When he finds out, his response is to take out his eyes, and he is banished. The point of discovery is also the point of knowing, of anagnorisis, and it is the most painful moment in Oedipus Rex. But however, what we find in many literary accounts of tragedy is that anagnorisis often comes too late. If Othello had known that Iago was tricking him, there would have been no tragedy. When he discovers too late, he's already killed his wife and he's lost his name. So anagnorisis. I'm going to dwell a little bit for my critique or qualification of Aristotle. I'm going to dwell a little bit on the concept of anagnorisis briefly. The second concept I'm going to put a bit of pressure on is the idea of eudaimonia, which we find not in the Poetics, but in the Nicomachean Ethics. In the Nicomachean Ethics, which is, of course, a book of moral philosophy. And moral philosophy, as we know, is not simply about knowing what is good from what is bad, but actually how to live. So once you know what is good and what is bad, how do you live your life? And so the Nicomachean Ethics is about the good life, eudaimonia. And among other things, Aristotle argues that to live a good life, to enjoy eudaimonia, you need two things that are interactive. One is the exercise of virtue, and virtue is a form of action. So the exercise of virtue augments your happiness and leads you to a good life. But the second thing, which is really fascinating and which distinguishes him from the Stoics, was that to have eudaimonia, you also needed the props or supports of external goods, such as the comforts of philia, both family and friends, the comfort of material accoutrements, the comfort of citizenship, the comfort of able-bodiedness, and so on. His argument is that if any of these fail, for me, the most important is the access to philia. If, for example, you woke up one fine afternoon and your entire family and all your friends were dead, according to Aristotle, you cannot enjoy eudaimonia. And so the comforts of philia are important for the enjoyment of the good life. But from a postcolonial perspective, we will see that Aristotle doesn't enact on the concept of eudaimonia. He doesn't pay enough attention to the impediments, contextual impediments to enjoying the comforts of philia in the first place. And by contextual impediments, from a post-colonial perspective, I have in mind specifically the colonial complex. Colonialism undid all the communal terms that held people together. And the post-colony, we have also sadly to acknowledge, has continued this mode of unthreading of the terms by which communities can hold themselves together. So eudaimonia does not take, or the Aristotelian discussion of eudaimonia does not take enough account of the contextual determinants, because the implication from what it says is that eudaimonia is merely a matter of choice making. If you make the right choices to live well, to be virtuous, and so on. Now, these are two, what follows are two specific critiques from a post-colonial perspective. When you look at Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, especially the essay, The Fact of Blackness, he highlights the difficulties within the colonial racial economy of maintaining the Black bodily schema of the Black man, woman. And this is because Fanon argues that racist or racism saturates space and time. So racism is not merely about something that you hear or perhaps see, but it's something that saturates the very concept of space and time. So that as a Black man traverses space and time, his or her body is discombobulated. This is almost a science fictional idea, but it's really about the existential effects of racism. And that's the first thing about Fanon, which is important as a critique of Aristotle. But the second thing is that unlike in Aristotle, where Aristotle is obviously talking about the theater, and so all his disquisitions in the Poetics have to do with an implicit separation between the tragic action and the effect on the audience. So when he speaks about catharsis and the emotions of pity and fear, he's really, actually not even implicit, he's explicitly separating the action on the theater and the effect on the audience. Fanon obliterates that distinction between theater and the audience because he is simultaneously at all times the spectator of the discombobulation of the bodily schema and also the actor in the psychodrama that is produced from colonialism. This idea of the tragedy not being distantiated, unlike Aristotle, Fanon says there is no gap between the tragic action and the drama of existence. This, collapse of the distance will allow us also to rethink notions of what pertains to the psycho-existential complex. I'll touch on it briefly when we come to Titi Dangaremba's nervous conditions. The next concept that I want to use to qualify Aristotle is that of the Akan concept of Musu. Now, I'm an Akan, and amongst the Akan, we have a concept of Musu means something roughly translated as harms to the soul or communal harms. And so if someone goes to the really bad examples like steal the sacrifice for the gods, you steal the sacrifice for the gods and eat it, it's considered major musu, or to have sex in the bush, it's considered musu, or sleep with an animal, a goat. These are all musu. However, my interest in musu is that on the occurrence of a musu, a really bad taboo, it is not just the agent of the Musu who suffers, but rather the witness-bearing community, i.e. the community of which this transgressor is a member, suffer a form of contamination, in the sense that the Musu is so powerful that it does not remain locked into the agent of Musu, but leaks into the community in general. And so in many African societies, it's not unusual for cleansing rituals to be activated in order to stem the pollution of the Musu of a particular agent. Now, why this concept interests me, and of course, many African traditions have concepts of harms to the soul. Why this concept interests me in particular is that in the history of Western discussions of tragedy, the tragic hero is considered an individual. Tragedy is an individual thing. So we find Othello or Hamlet or any number of tragic protagonists that we found. What is not often taken into account is the effect of the tragedy upon the witness-bearing community. And so, in fact, in much of literature, even Western literature, we have examples in Western literature where the major reversal of fortunes of the hero or heroine leads to a form of shocked anagnorisis. That is to say, the recognition does not reside just with the hero or heroine. It's the collapse of the hero or heroine, the reversal of fortune, leads to a shocked sense of awareness of the precarity of human life. Now, that shocked sense of awareness is, for me, registered very readily in the concept of Musu. What I seek to do with this concept is to show that there is constantly a dialectical relationship between the individual's tragedy and the effect on the community. This, to me, seems, very African. Growing up, an individual's disaster never affected them alone. It's just, we never thought that way. So I incorporate it into my critique of Aristotle. Now, for a working definition of suffering, because tragedy is not just a formal set of requirements, as Aristotle lays out, but it's a particular set of contents. And suffering is really important to any definition of tragedy. Now, what I define for suffering, by the way, going back slightly, the Oxford English Dictionary has 18 different entries for the word to suffer, 18. And the 18 definitions encompass everything from being a victim of a form of violence to being actively choosing to suffer in silence. So one set of definitions is being a victim. The other set is actually choosing to suffer. I'm going to choose to suffer this insult. To even being resistant to the negative effect. So resistance to suffering is also part of the definition of suffering that we find on the OED. What I'm interested in, though, is to define suffering as anticipated or experienced factors that generate a feeling of the threat to self-integration. This is really important. That, to me, suffering is when one feels a threat to their capacity to be self-integrated. And this threat to their capacity to be self-integrated can have also a communal dimension. And so the factors that lead to threats to self-integration are many. Poverty, if you're extremely poor, lack of access to good health care, All these lead to threats to the idea of self-integration. But also important, as we shall see in many of the examples that we are going to touch upon, the threat to self-integration can also come from the collapse of hermeneutical frameworks. The framework by which you say, I believe in God, which is, it's hemmed around by certain assertions, sacred assertions from the Bible, by churches, your priest, and so on. All those frame the epistemological structure of a declaration such as, I am a Christian. If there's a collapse within that hermeneutical framework, it can lead to a sense of disintegration and therefore suffering. The key point I'm making here is that tragedy does not require catastrophe. So going back to the ordinary everyday definition of tragedy, it's sad, there's trouble, and so on. Tragedy does not require catastrophe to be tragic. What we need to detail is the threat to self-integration. And so when we focus on when we concentrate on threats to self-integration, we can see quite clearly a distinction to be drawn between, say, Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Dangarembe's Nervous Conditions, both of which are tragic and both of which we're going to comment on as we proceed. But they are tragic in distinctive ways. And so Achebe's novel illustrates what seems to me a fairly straightforward Aristotelian paradigm, whereas Dangarembas illustrates the problem of a continuing psycho-existential complex. So this is what I've tried to do, is to give in brief a number of definitions and qualifications to the core definitions of the idea of tragedy. Now, I'm going to go through, hopefully in the next 20 minutes, a number of texts, textual fragments. Now, we find in Things Fall Apart, this is very well known. Things Fall Apart is always good to start any discussion of anything in African literature, for the simple reason that it is most likely to be the one text that people who have no idea about African literature are likely to have read. And let me say something that I've repeated many times in different contexts, and that is that you cannot claim to be educated in the world today without having read Things Fall Apart. It doesn't matter whether you're a STEM person or sociology or whatever it is. If you haven't read Things Fall Apart, you are not yet educated. Let me just lay it out there. Now, this is at the very end of the novel. We are familiar with this scene. They have met to discuss the Umufians have met to discuss the egregious insults that has been visited upon the lords of their clan, including Okonkwo. Okonkwo is sitting at the edge of the big meeting at the market, and he is confronted by the 6 or 7 messengers from the district commissioner. And this is what we see. I'm starting from the second paragraph. He sprang to his feet as soon as he saw who it was. He confronted the head messenger, trembling with hate, unable to utter a word. The man was fearless and stood his ground. His 4 men lined up behind him. So there were 5, not 7. In that brief moment, the world seemed to stand still, waiting. There was utter silence. The men of Umuofia were merged into the mute black backcloth of trees and giant creepers, waiting. The spell was broken by the head messenger. "Let me pass," he ordered. "What do you want here?" The white man, whose power you know too well, has ordered this meeting to stop. In a flash, Okonkwo drew his machete. The messenger crouched to avoid the blow. It was useless. Okonkwo's machete descended twice, and the man's head lay beside his uniformed body. The waiting backlot jumped into tumultuous life, and the meeting stopped. Okonkwo stood looking at the dead man, he knew that Umuofia would not go to war. He knew because they had let the other messengers escape. They had broken into tumult instead of action. He discerned fright in the tumult. He heard voices asking, why did he do it? Now, this is a very pregnant passage because it is the moment of Aristotelian peripeteia, which is the reversal of fortunes. However, the thing that I'm most interested in is the very last paragraph when he heard voices asking, why did he do it? Now, this tumult and the question that he hears also implies that the Umuofians consider his action, which is killing the messenger, a form of epistemological impasse. They don't understand it. So the question, why did he do that, is a sign that his action makes no sense within the established codes of Umuofia. But what are these established codes? What we find, of course, on closer examination, that this act, which 200 pages earlier would have meant a straightforward declaration of an act of war, is now, after the encounter with colonialism, no longer so certain in its meanings. And so when they ask, why did he do that? It is literally the sign of a historical crisis. Now, the novel, of course, is not interested in exploring what that historical crisis means. And so, for example, the novel does not tell us in the next paragraph. It tells us that Obierika could not take down his friend because his friend was contaminated. What he had done, committing suicide, we find Okonkwo hanging from the tree, is anathema. It's a musu, according to the terms of Umuofia. But Achebe retreats from telling us what other Umuofians felt. It is natural that his best friend Obierika will feel offended, affronted, and shocked by what has happened to his friend. But Achebe does not tell us whether this Musuo gets a response from the rest of Umuofia. So the novel ends in the very next, very short paragraph. We also do not know how the family of Okonkwo might have felt to the suicide of their father, husband, and so on, the head of their household. Now, this retreat, and I'm calling it a retreat in a way controversially because it's a novel. This is where he stopped and that's it. But it is not so, because what I want to suggest is that this, first of all, the depiction of the reversal of fortunes in the case of Okonkwo, the depiction of a sense of epistemological crisis for his people, but the non-depiction of what their response might have been, what, for example, his family, his Obi's response might have been, is part of the long process in African representations of tragedy of individualizing the tragic. This is not something that can be, I'm laying it out in a way as a talking point. It requires a more elaborate, setting up, because repeatedly we see that even though in Things Fall Apart, we've been given an example of communal ideals and so on. When it comes to the tragic moment, the tragedy, as it were, flips. It retreats from a communal assertion of values to the assertion of tragedy as being an individual event. In fact, this idea of tragedy being an individual event is actually depicted processually in the novel, because we see much earlier that some people in Umuofia have benefited from the colonial encounter, such as it's mentioned, the shops that have been set up to export palm kernel. So some people have become wealthy from the export of palm kernel. Let me move on to the next extract. And this is from one of my favorite characters in African literature is Ezeulu from Arrow of God. Arrow of God is very different from Things Fall Apart. First of all, everybody is angry in Arrow of God. Kids are angry. Ezeulu is angry. His wives are angry. Co-wives are quarreling. But it's not just them. Winterbottom, the district commissioner, Mr. Winterbottom, is also angry. People are angry in this novel all the time. And the question is why? Why is everyone depicted as angry? But the second thing is that it is also a novel in which the central character is highly interiorized. Okonkwo has no interiority. In fact, there are only two moments in the entire novel, Things Fall Apart, where we see what is happening inside his mind. He's a man of action. He's not a man of interiority. Whereas Ezeulu is highly interiorized. The third thing about Arrow of God, which we do not find in Things Fall Apart, is how the community of Umuaru cannot agree on anything. So they're angry. Ezeulu is highly interiorized, and they do not agree on anything. And so a proverb that we find repeated more than once in Arrow of God would have no place in Things Fall Apart, which is wisdom is like a goat skin bag. Everyone carries his own. This is unthinkable. In the unanimous traditionalism of Things Fall Apart, such a proverb would be unthinkable. At any rate, I want us to delve into the mind of Ezeulu. This occurs very early in the novel when Ezeulu is contemplating his position as the priest of Ulu. Whenever Ezeulu considered the immensity of his power over the year and the crops, and therefore over the people, he wondered if it was real. It was true he named the day for the feast of the pumpkin leaves and for the new yam feast, but he did not choose it. He was merely a watchman. His power was no more than the power of a child over a goat that was said to be his. As long as the goat was alive, it could be his. He would find it food and take care of it. But the day it was slaughtered, he would know soon enough who the real owner was. No! The chief priest of Ulu was more than that, must be more than that. If he should refuse to name the day, there would be no festival, no planting, and no reaping. But could he refuse? No chief priest had ever refused. So it could not be done. He would not dare. Ezeulu was stung to anger by this, as though his enemy had spoken it. Take away that word dare, he replied to this enemy. Yes, I say, take it away. No man in all Umuaru can stand up and say that I dare not. The woman who will bear the man who will say it has not been born yet. But this rebuke brought only momentary satisfaction. His mind, never concerned with shallow satisfactions, crept again to the brink of knowing. What kind of power was it if it would never be used? Better to say that it was not there, that it was no more than the power in the anus of the proud dog who sought to put out a furnace with his puny fat. He turned the yam with a stick. Now, Ezeulu is fascinating to me because he exemplifies what David Scott describes as conscripts to modernity. He's a conscript of modernity, not in the sense of conscription to the Enlightenment project of modernity, which is what David Scott describes. So the conscripts to of modernity, so the conscripts of modernity were those locals in various parts of empire who were somehow enamored of the Enlightenment project. Ezeulu is not enamored of any Enlightenment project as such, but he is curious about what Christianity represents as a world historical process. And so we know that he sends his youngest son, Uduche, to be his eyes and ears amongst the Christians. He's embedding him, as it were. And this is actually, this figure, completely nativist, actually, in many respects, Ezeulu is completely nativist, but who somehow dissent intuits that the colonial encounter represents a world historical moment of great significance for his own people, and so wants to know about it. This is not unusual. Historically, many native peoples actually had this idea. So he's enamored of it. But being enamored of it also means that he expresses, and these points are overlap but not entirely clear. They do not align that clearly. He is also curious about his social activist role as a chief priest. So he's a nativist, he's a traditionalist, but he wants to define his ambit of action more fully than has been assigned him in this historical moment. Now, this worrying about the ambit of action is what we see in this stream of consciousness, this moment, because he's wondering whether his role is merely to name the feast of the pumpkin leaves and for the new yam field. What is that as being the chief priest of Ulu? He wants to do more, and he describes what more he wants to do in a later conversation with his best friend when he is, temporarily exiled and detained at Okperi. But the other aspect of this moment here is the degree to which Ezewulu's mind incorporates a skeptical interlocutor. So when he thinks to himself, he would not dare, he is stung to anger by this as though his enemy had spoken it. This integration of the skeptical interlocutor is also actually a very important feature of the Enlightenment project, doubt. The assumption of doubt as an aspect of the establishment of the affirmations of oneself. This can be writ large, going through Enlightenment philosophy. Ezewulu has no idea about Enlightenment philosophy, but his consciousness, as depicted by Achebe, indicates this incorporation of the skeptical interlocutor into the shape of his own thinking. The final thing before we leave this is how, in fact, it is not just the question of doubt and the incorporation of skeptical interlocution. It's not just a feature of Ezewulu's mind, but it's a feature of the Umuaru in general. It's for that they cannot agree on anything. But their lack of agreement is actually also the product of this historical encounter with colonialism. What happens at the end of Arrow of God, of course, is that he makes a mistake. He refuses to eat the last of the ritual yams. And so he delivers his community entirely to the Christians. And he goes mad at the end because his son, Obika, dies suddenly. One of the things that has really baffled me about both Things Fall Apart and Arrow of God is that great novels as they are, and many people have read both of them as novels about, the encounter or against colonialism, is that both novels actually depict the failure of mobilization. Both novels. In the case of Things Fall Apart, it's quite explicit. It's a failure of mobilization of sentiment against colonialism. So even though they've been used as, post-colonial novels of the colonial encounter, they signally show the failure of or collapse of mobilization of sentiment. The other thing that they show, and I'm echoing something that I said at the end of the discussion of Things Fall Apart, is that in this novel, the chief priest of Ulu has gone mad. There is no sign in the world of Umuaru that anyone recognizes the tragic consequence of the chief priest madness. That is to say, that actually something majorly wrong has happened in their culture. Of course, Achebe very cleverly weaves into this moment of the chief priest madness the existential anxiety about ritual survival. And that is why when the Christians offer to receive the new yams, they all go to the new yams. But we wonder, what might it mean for the Umuarans not to note that their chief priest's madness is the sign of something having gone awry in the universe? Achebe retreats from that depiction. He retreats from giving us, from going back into Ezewulu's family. So we don't know what his wives and kids feel about this. But it goes back to the point I was making earlier about the contraction into individualism. So tragedy somehow contracts the tragic into a crisis for the individual. Now, I see that I have just a few minutes remaining, and so I am going to skip and go to Dangarenga's nervous conditions. Now, this is also a famous moment in nervous conditions when Nyasha suffers a nervous collapse. And she rampages, she shreds her history books with her teeth, and she says they have trapped us. They being colonialism, all of colonialism have trapped us. And then as suddenly as it came, the rage passed. She says, I don't hate you, Daddy, she said softly. They want me to, but I won't. She lays down on her bed. I'm very tired, she said in a voice that recognizably hurt. But I can't sleep. Now, this moment is really fascinating because throughout the novel, we've been building up a profile of Nyasha as a very, very independent-minded girl, highly self-conscious, and also interpretatively aware. So, for example, she makes a really beautiful statement about the colonial logic inherent in their school books. She reads widely. So she's always telling her cousin, Tambo, that these books are, instruments of colonial brainwashing. She's also very astute about what her father seeks to do. Her father needs to convert her into a good girl. A good girl really for Baba Mukuru meant marriageability. To be a good girl, it means you're marriageable. But of course, his daughter realizes that really what her father wants her to do, or he wants to achieve, is to produce as it were, a good native involved in producing a good girl or a marriageable girl is also the production of a pliable native subject. And his daughter sees all this. The problem is that there is the pressure to perform. She wants to pass her exams at the same time as maintaining this skepticism about what are the options available. But however, the other thing that is fascinating to me is how the nervous conditions also demonstrates a kind of reverse trajectory, in the sense that Tambo leaves the homestead to enter the household of Baba Mukuru, her principal uncle, and as it were, gain the benefits of modernity, which is enshrined in knowledge. Whereas Nyasha is already where Tambo wants to get to. So Tambo is journeying toward where Nyasha is already standing. But Nyasha, being so astute and intelligent, realizes that Western education is a form of abyss. And she has stared into the abyss and found in it nothing but darkness, or nothing but elements that seek to disintegrate the black self. And so the novel is beautiful for craft trajectories. Tambo wants to get to where Nyasha is, but Nyasha already knows that where Tambo wants to arrive at is a source of negation. And so to conclude, so these are other themes in what we might conceive as tragedy in African literature. Colonialism and the curtailment of the proper ambit of heroic action. We find it in Achebe, Shoyinka, and Guge. The ambiguation of attitudes to personal and collective pasts, Achebe again, Najib Mahfouz, especially Midak Ali. The violent conscription to the nation state, for example, Dambujo Marechere's House of Hunger, and also even various Without a Name and various others. Aesthetic capture, the aesthetic capture of the will and the plot of inertia. This requires a whole separate disquisition. There are many novels in African literature which have a tragic bearing in which nothing seems to happen. But also where somehow the aesthetic values capture or prevent the will from rebelling. We see it in The Famish Road, but we also see it in G.M. Coetzee's Waiting for Barbarians. And then a woman's self-nervous conditions. Dangaremba, I've already mentioned, even Vera, but also Bessie Head, A Question of Power. It's really, really interesting how in the women writers actually incorporate the principle of nervous conditions suggested by Fanon. Fanon says it's actually Jean Paul Sartre writing about Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, that the condition of the native is a nervous condition. It's actually the female African writers of tragedy who managed to implement that idea and the principle in their representations of tragedy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ato. We cannot give you anything more than digital applause, so take this from me. Thanks so much. This is quite interesting to think about and think with. Sorry, everyone watching for that snafu at the beginning. I think my YouTube channel was up, so I was hearing myself and I didn't know what was happening. But what I was trying to say at that moment was that this series of lectures is a public-facing initiative by the Executive Council, and the idea is to actually engage more with our members, those who are already members to be more interested in the association, and those who are really trying to see what we're doing to also become even more dedicated and interested and join us really to get you to be interested. And in which sense then I would like to say that there is an opportunity for people watching to put comments in the chat box on live chat, and so we can actually take questions to engage with what Ato has been telling us for the past half hour. So we have a comment that is actually along the lines on which I'm also thinking. So to start off, while we're waiting for people to become more engaged and really respond to this in a very interactive way, I'd like to say from, I think there's maybe an Akin member, somebody who has a Ghanaian name, so to speak. I think it's Kwame Boafo. Actually, it's a comment, and so I'll use that comment to develop what seems to me to be a question worth asking on the basis of what you've given us, Ato. Essentially to say that the definition, to say that much of the concept of tragedy that you've drawn upon, and that in fact Western concepts really never took account of what he calls a black body. You know, that is epistemologically we did not exist, black people did not exist. And so, and listening to you too, I mean, you brought up Fanon very early, but starting with Aristotle itself, I found a bit, of course, it's very highly systematized, and you were able to establish a lot of correlations, especially drawing on the concept of Musu. But I was hoping to hear at least you, since you've written a lot about Wole Soyinka, to hear you talk about something like the fourth stage, where there's been a description of tragedy, and also what your countryman, Ayikwe has actually tried to say about a tragic figure, historic tragic figure in our own history, like Chaka Zulu. So these are actually interesting things. I mean, because the Musuo, very extremely suggestive and extremely well thought out, seems in a sense to just say that it's only Akan who think this. What do individual Akan people, or those who have now encountered modernity, okay, and who will read like Soyinka, Achebe? I mean, towards the end, you brought up Titi Dam Garenga, and then you extended that to Vera Bessie Head. So all of that is interesting. So, but at least there's still, and I guess the idea is to then, in fact, say that we can also supply our own theory. So
actually, let me point out that Soyinka's theory of tragedy in the fourth stage was heavily dependent on Nietzsche. He read Nietzsche really well. And what he did was to use Nietzsche as a template for thinking through his own, Yoruba theory of tragedy. So when you read it, in fact, I've written about this in the forthcoming book. I have a whole chapter. Soyinka is one of the people that I deal with. So I discuss it. The point I want to make is that I don't think it is feasible or wise to generate a theory of tragedy and ignore the many statements on tragedy that are already existing. In fact, you can't do it. You cannot say, well, I'm going to produce a new theory of tragedy and I'm going to ignore all that has been written on tragedy so far. I don't think it's viable. And as I just pointed out, Soyinka in his wisdom turns to Nietzsche, and he produces what is a really valuable theory of tragedy, which is Nietzschean. I explain what are the Nietzschean bits and so on. The more important point, and which is what I try to establish in the book, is that in the history of discussions of what might pass as a tragedy in literature, the post-colonial world has had no visibility, none. In other words, and I discuss in detail George Steiner, Raymond Williams, and Terry Eagleton. Now, to say what you will find in the chapter, which is the introductory chapter, Terry Eagleton publishes slow violence, not slow violence, sweet violence in 2005. By 2005, Soyinka has won the Nobel Prize. Najib Mahfouz has won the Nobel Prize. G.M. Coetzee won it in 2003. Toni Morrison has already won it. V.S. Naipaul has won the Nobel Prize, and so on. And all of these people have produced what are very, very excellent representations of tragedy, drawing from the experiences of the non-Western world. And I could extend the list exponentially. I have them all in there. And yet, Terry Eagleton is able to write this huge book, and the focus is on the idea of sacrifice. He starts with the Abrahamic sacrifice, near sacrifice of Isaac. And he's able to write about sacrifice and its relationship to tragedy without mentioning a single post-colonial text at all. 2005. And so I say to myself, why is it that in the post-colonial world, where the conditions of precarity are evident, the conditions of precarity are evident, not only that, where people have written very deeply about the question of suffering, disintegration of community, why is it that by 2005, after the list of all these worthy prize winners who have written novels and everyone is reading them, he doesn't even mention Achebe. Achebe does not appear. Conrad, he talks about Conrad, but doesn't mention Achebe's critique of Conrad. One of the things I sought to do is to challenge this kind of blind content to what are actually some of the most exciting contributions to the whole idea of tragedy. So that's what I try to do in my book. But to do this, I cannot abolish the already existing, and by the way, very, very fertile thinking on tragedy. So I actually don't think that the way to proceed, what we need to do is to understand ourselves. What does Musu mean? And every African culture will likely have. But how does this allow us to understand suffering in a way to cross-illuminate? I tell my students, for example, that if you want to really understand Sophocles, you have to read Achebe. So read Achebe first, and with what you have from Achebe, go and read Sophocles. You see that Sophocles makes more sense because you've read Achebe. So basically, the long and short is that I don't think that that discourse of, oh, we need to do our own, how do you call it, our own ideas, and it's why we're using Western. That's not how it works. Not in scholarship. You can do it around the palm wine drink card. As you're drinking palm wine, you can say what you like. But to be really scholarly and responsible, you can do that.
Okay, all right. I'll take questions that are coming in. There's a question from Tony Ada, who I think is the old colleague in Toronto, asking if you think the publishing process, the politics of publishing may have put pressures on writers like Achebe into basically given characters like Okonkwo, what you call individualizing characteristic rather than a communal kind of, especially towards the end of the novel. So that's the one. And there's another question. So if you want to know that before I put another one so that you take them before more come in. The second one is by Morade Jumobi, asking if you think that a recent historical novel like Jennifer Makumbi's Chintu fits into this pattern of tragedy that you try to lay out for African literature. So those two, there are more, but if you can just take this.
Let me answer Tony's question first. I don't think it's the pressures of publishing that leads to, so Achebe is writing things for Lapata and says, oh, let me produce an individualizing form of tragedy. It's not the pressures of publishing, but it's the nature of colonial education. Because the nature of colonial education, its ultimate objective is to neoliberalize our consciousness. And it's not just colonial education. Today, even education today, Christianity, the combination of Christianity, Westernization, and Western education, the effect was to ambiguate our responses to our own cultures. And it's sometimes forms of disavowal. I had a conversation with the dearly departed Abiola Irele once, many years ago, about Things Fall Apart. And he said something that I've never forgotten. He says, only a Christian could have written Things Fall Apart. I said, really, Prof, why do you say that? Only a Christian like Achebe could have written Things Fall Apart because it represents, in a way, the victory of Christianity, not of colonialism. And we see the victory of Christianity more explicitly in Arrow of God. Not only that, it also represents a kind of, he was brought up in all the best Igbo traditions, but Christianity told him that all this is heathenism. It is this self-division that allows him to detail a culture that he thinks it's abating so well. And so it is not in the, I'm going to publish a novel which will individual. I don't think that is it. It is the very, as it were, ideational structures of our educational systems emphasize the ideational, and we absorb them unconsciously. They emphasize the individual as opposed to the community. So that's it. In terms of Morado, thanks for your question. I have to embarrassingly admit, I bought Akin too, and I have it, but I haven't yet read it. So unfortunately, I have to reserve my comments.
Okay. Anyway, well, you now have a challenge to read it. So
Yeah, I
take
have it. Yeah.
a question from Sreya. Sreya Data. I think I'm trying to see. Yes, asking if just a minute. Oh, yeah.
Against the mobilization, lack of
Yeah.
mobilization.
Oh, can you see?
Yes.
Okay. So the idea is whether a curious aspect of the fact that maybe that in fact contributes to
Yes, I've seen it. The lack of mobilization. One of the novels that I discovered in writing my book that I discovered was eerily similar to the overall idea of Things Fall Apart was a novel by Tolstoy called Haji Murat.
Okay, yeah.
Haji Murat. It's not very long.
It's a novella.
The novella is small. And Haji Murad I think is Chechenian war of independence against the big Russian bear. And it's very, very, in fact, you could read it post-colonially.
Yeah.
The thinking, colonialism, the way that the both sides marshal for war and so on. And that novel is a pure novel about mobilization against colonial intrusion. It's it's a novella, it's very small, but it's very post-colonial, we might say. However, the big difference between Haj Murad, Tolstoy's novel, and Things Fall Apart is that in Things Fall Apart, as I've just noted, and also in Arrow of God, there's a good profile of the colonial in Arrow of God, Winterbottom and Tony Clark and so on. They are profiled and they are actually humanized. And we see the contradictions in the colonial knowledge economy. He does that beautifully in Arrow of God. So the colonial knowledge economy is riddled by contradictions. The native does not know this, but Achebe lets us see. And yet, there is no, it's almost like a disavowal of a particular form of conflict, which is explicit in Haj Murad. That is the conflict between the colonizer and the colonized. Achebe doesn't want to go there. Now, we don't want to fault him. It would have been wonderful to have asked him, why is it that the Umofians don't rise up? And the novel itself has an answer, which is that they couldn't because things had already fallen apart amongst them. So the novel gives the answer. The answer is that they are no longer the unified group that they were. So part of it is there. But one wonders how the novel would have been if Achebe, even if he died at the end. So I'm not saying that they win, but they fight. What would have happened if there was a proper mobilization and even they were defeated? That is snuffed out quickly. And
Sam Adebayo.
Yeah,
the idea of thinking, I mean, it's somewhat similar to Moradeon's questions, but although Moradeon's question is specific to that novel. So, I mean, the idea is if you move away from the colonial experience and think about what, I mean, the guy, Adebayo uses neo-colonial, we use post-colonial, but of course, what,
the overlap.
The idea is, of course, that, whether it's possible to actually reflect on this within your concept and think of how African experiences, African literature may have been reshaped in the process.
Well, the nature of the tragedy of war, we have lots of examples of the tragedy of war in the Greeks. You see why it's not possible to ignore earlier examples. The Greek tragedies, Agamemnon and Philoctetes, tragedies set in the context of the Trojan War and the Danae and so on. The thing is that war heightens emergency. And so war heightens emergency so that the process of ethical choice making it takes on a different hue in context of war. And we see great examples among the Greeks to have instigated mobilization of sentiment would also have meant altering the template within which the choices that characters such as Okonkwo make would have been made. Now, this is not to say that they wouldn't have ended badly or tragically, that there would not have been a death and so on. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the form of the choice of what to do, the ethical choice making will have been different because the context in which the choices had to be made, which is the context of war, will have produced different inflections to the choice making. As I said, the Greeks have great examples of Agamemnon is told to sacrifice his daughter so that the Greek ships can sail to Troy. He thinks about it. He thinks about it for all of 5 minutes. And he sacrifices his daughter. What is the meaning of this? It is that war produces a state of emergency so that your choice and that's itself, even in the choosing of that's all. So this is, I don't think I'll go as far as saying this is a weakness or a blindness of Achebe, but it's definitely something that he does twice of refuting the mobilization of sentiment. So we need to pay attention to it.
In fact, we actually had a brief discussion about Achebe's realism, when you started these videos. And I did point out, because the comment you made about Abiola Relay saying that things fall apart will only have been written by a Christian, was actually satirized in Ayikwe recent novel, The Resolutionaries. Of course, it gives a different name to the novel because the center cannot hold. And essentially was saying that this is the colonial missionary kind of model. But that's Ayikwe and Achebe fighting, really. So there's a bit of that in there. But there's another question and a comment. The question is by Komavi, which actually tries to go even further, especially in terms of the question of our history. That's African historical experience of slavery. The idea is whether you think it's possible to actually bring that experience within this the ambit of the frame of tragedy that you developed, especially since in the experience of African societies where slavery took place, it was always experienced at the communal level. And so that's the question. The comment is by Henrietta Okafor, essentially trying to draw some kind of parallel between Izelu's experience and the kind of isolation that COVID-19 has imposed on the world.
Okay, let me go to the COVID-19 question. I'll go back to Kumavi's question. The COVID-19 question and the question of tragedy. One of the things that COVID-19 has shown us, and this is a common experience, is how much we are dependent on the care and acknowledgement of others. So I'm here, I'm worried about what's happening to Akin. Is he okay? Has any member of his family got COVID or not? But I'm not able to meet Akin in person. I can't because we are not allowed to. Now, this is a frustration of failure. It's a frustration of failure. It's a frustration of the care for family and friends, near and far. And that is leading to a form of, as it were, unsettlement. We are all feeling unsettled because we cannot be with those whom we care most about. And we know that COVID is a blight, it's a plague upon us. So that's the first thing. The second thing has to do with the events following George Floyd. And here I want to read it from a tragic perspective, but not in the commonplace usage. What we saw in that video that many people have shared and many of us saw was actually a tragic tableau. It's a tragic tableau of injustice. That is to say, a white man, policeman, kneeling. He put his knee on the neck of a black man who was lying prostrate. Even the spatial arrangement of that tableau is fascinating. The white is up, the black is down, neck on knee, and so on and so forth. However, our responses, our outrage is partly, of course, the injustice of seeing this and so on, but also because, and this is what comes back to the Musu question, that many people felt that this was so unjust that by bearing witness to it, we were contaminated. And the sense of injustice was explicit. Now there's no ambiguity that there's injustice. In previous shootings of Black folk and so on, there was always room for ambiguation. And so those who wanted to look away could say that, oh, but it was ambiguous anyway. How do you know? This one, it was unambiguous that a major injustice was taking place. And in that tableau that we saw, we couldn't do anything about it. And so the outrage was partly, I think, a sense of collective contamination. This injustice is polluting us. Our source of self is being polluted. And so the subsequent expressions of we need to rectify racial injustice in the large. So this is something that we can read through a tragic template, not just of, oh, how bad it is and so on, but actually that the performativity inside the tableau enjoins us to a form of action. There's no catharsis possible except for justice. You cannot say, oh, I'm going to see it and it's okay. It's no, catharsis is not possible except we find justice. And this is what the tableau of the guys killing shows us, connected to the fact that we're already locked down and our access to failure is impaired because of the COVID.
Okay. So yeah, you said you respond to the one about slavery because there have been several other questions. Really, the core of the questions, because we're actually also, getting to the end of the session, and I want to give people who have been responding.
Okay, the slavery.
So if you want to take all those things together.
The slavery question, because in African literature, unfortunately, there's not that much depiction of slavery. If we want to answer that question, we have to switch to African American literature, where the depiction of slavery there's a lot of it, and there's very, very astute and good depictions of slavery and the dissolution of the Black self. In fact, I have an episode in my critic reading writing, which by the way, I strongly encourage all of you to subscribe, on Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Yeah.
Where it is clear that the setting of Beloved is after the Emancipation Declaration. So we are looking at is post 1863 and 1865. Yeah. And then what we find there is that the overbearing question that hangs upon the novel Beloved is, what should a Black person do to be free after slavery? So how do you craft yourself in freedom when in living memory, less than 10 years before, you were just an object to be passed around? Now, this burden of defining one's freedom after slavery, different characters in Morrison's novel have different answers. And the answers don't coincide. The answers do not coincide. There are different answers, but it's a question which actually produces tragic consequences, in that to answer that question is also to submit the self to the threat of disintegration. In African literature, I can't think of the top, I stand to be corrected, of any. There have been depictions of Yajisi's novel, for example, Homegoings and so on, but it's not a tragic novel.
But there's Anoa?
Yeah, Anoa, yeah. This woman's play.
Amataidu?
Amataidu, yeah. But Anoa is a heroic, tragic heroic. Okay. Yeah, we don't have the kinds of depictions, I would say, the range and quality that we find in African-American literature. So to answer that question, we have to switch to African-American literature.
All right. So here is actually a good moment to stop because, as I said, although there are a few more reactions there, essentially along this line to the idea of really expanding this beyond the scope of the colonial encounter. And it's also clear from your list of texts that they're talking, for instance, about Yvonne Vera, although it's colonialism, but you already see an attempt to deal with the post minority rule in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, for instance. So there's already that template, and I think that it's also clear, of course, that engaging now with more contemporary writers, Chintu, or even much more recent novels who open this up. So thank you very much, and thank you for those who have developed questions and engaged with us. This is going to be a monthly event. Next month, this is October, will be Morade Adejumobi, who will be talking about our work. We will send out invitations about that and give you firm it up in terms of details of time. And of course, this is going to be the venue. And then later in the year, we'll have two writers, two scholars, that Lily Saint and Bati Shingampuri, talking about the short provocative essay they published in Africa as a Country. So that's it. And then, of course, in the new year, we have more. So thank you very much, Ato, for kicking this off.
Thank you, Akin. Thank you, Matthew. Thanks to everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Bye.